When I think about pedagogical strategies, as I was preparing for this, I stepped back and thought, okay, what does this apply to in my own thinking of supporting learning? And it goes back to when I made the shift from teaching face-to-face to teaching online. Like I think a lot of folks, I assumed I had to transfer everything I did in the face-to-face, which I believed, and there was evidence that it was working well, to the online environment, and it didn't work very well for me or the students. And so the big shift for me came to thinking about it from the perspective of creating conditions. How do I create conditions as the instructor, regardless of the environment or the forum, that's going to best support learning? And so again, in thinking of teacher, instructor as creating those conditions based on, in this case, thinking of the science of learning, I also think about in terms of individual, what does the student need to do on their own? So their own study skills that was noted a moment ago, as well as the teacher as the individual who can help instruct the student in some of those study skills. But also structurally speaking, how do I create conditions that through the way the class is designed, the way the assignments are designed, and then even stepping back one step further is thinking about from a program point of view. So when I look at the question of how do I infuse these learning principles, these two strategies, for example, into the work with my students individually, and then things that they can do on their own to study in designing and implementing my class, and then also connections to the program, which for me is our MED in teaching and learning. Now, Katie, did you want me just to share a couple of examples or?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Okay. And so I think it was already mentioned, and I think, I don't remember who that was, but someone mentioned about, several of you have mentioned about your assignments, like Deanne, for example, having a draft due before the final assignment. I think, again, that's a way of structuring your class and your assignments so that it builds in these, it infuses these pedagogical strategies. I think I will speak for a moment in terms of kind of the spacing idea. Another thing that comes to mind is the rhythm and flow of a class. How do I start the class to bring the students into this space where we're focusing on something very likely very different than what they're doing through the rest of their day? Most of my students are practicing educators in different settings, and then they come into a class. How am I going to help settle them into what it is that we're focusing on, provide that space, taking the spacing strategy, as well as in the retrieval, as we then settle into perhaps have a moment of silence or bring in like the KWL chart that I mentioned, or a reflective question that has them make that transition. So thinking again, the space as the spacing as a space for that transition into what we're going to focus on. So that rhythm and flow of settling, then involved or engaged in an activity, and then coming back to, again, perhaps a moment of silence or settling where they can have a structured reflection activity, etc. So that's really an important piece, I think, in the terms of an example of infusing it in a class. Another example that comes to mind is something called Think, Pair, Share. And I think of this in terms of both retrieval and spacing, that if we are putting out we're wanting to encourage conversation or discussion about a concept or whatever it is that we're focusing on, but giving them all a moment, pose the question, give each of the students a chance to think, perhaps do some writing themselves about in their response to that, and then pairing up to have a conversation with one of their classmates, and then sharing that to the whole group, what they discussed. That's just another simple strategy that builds in both spacing and perhaps retrieval. The next level in terms of thinking about program, again, this is stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. How do we create programs that create those conditions that support learning